Why are wages so low? Real wages have fallen dramatically since the 1970s. Of course, the actual dollar amount on people's paychecks has increased since the 1970s. But when we're talking about real wages, we're talking about how much that paycheck is in comparison to how much people have to spend in order to live. In comparison to the costs of everyday expenses, such as childcare, college, healthcare, housing, transportation, utilities, etc., the cost of living has gone up, and yet paychecks have not gone up with it. Real paychecks have fallen since the 1950s and 60s. And I think a lot of us are familiar with stories about people 2 or 3 generations ago who were able to have one person in the house working and be able to afford a house very easily just with one job. So real wages have been dramatically stagnant since the 1970s. This is in contrast to the era post World War II, the 1950s and 60s, when median incomes actually doubled in just 2 decades. And during that period of time, the poorest workers were the ones who made the most progress in their increasing wage. However, since the 1970s, median incomes in the United States have stagnated just about any way you can measure it. For example, from 1947 to 1970, there was a 2% increase in earnings for the bottom 90% of U.S. workers. But since 1970, there's only been a 0.5% increase in earnings for the bottom 90% of U.S. workers. Another way of measuring incomes is to compare to the past. By the 1990s, a significant percentage of workers were earning less than their counterparts had in the 1960s. And you can also see that wages have fallen if you divide people into different groups, such as based on gender. Wages for male workers with a high school degree or less have fallen over the past 40 years. Wages for male workers with a college degree have been completely stagnant for the past 20 or even 25 years, depending on exactly how you count it. The only group who has seen wages increase is women, but even the increase in wages for women is very small compared to historical standards, and it still hasn't allowed women's wages to catch up to men's. The only workers who haven't experienced a decline in real wages are the top 10%. The richest people have gotten richer since the 1970s. But everybody else has seen their wages be stagnant or even become poorer. And this problem with wages has hit the poorest people the hardest. In this video, we're going to look at the reasons why this has happened. I knew that wages had remained stagnant or even declined, but my question was, why? What has happened to cause this? So I looked up some research on the topic, and what I found is that there are actually many causes for wage stagnation and or decline. It's not just one thing that you can pinpoint and say, aha, here's the thing that is causing this. Instead, it's a whole host of factors all working together. I put all these factors in a list, and I just listed them in alphabetical order, not according to which is most important or which came first, because honestly, almost all these factors started in the 1970s and continue today. So here's your list in alphabetical order that we're going to be going through: automation, contract work, imports and or trade policy, large corporate buyers, macroeconomic policy, minimum wage decline, redistribution of wages within companies, shareholder orientation of companies, and unions losing power. And then very briefly at the end, we'll talk about some of the incorrect explanations people sometimes believe for this wage decline and discuss why there isn't a lot of evidence for these ideas. First, let's start with automation. Automation is when a job used to be done by a person, but now it's done by a computer or a robot. Middle skill jobs, like the ones in manufacturing and in offices, are most susceptible to automation. However, automation is starting to affect lots of other jobs, specifically higher paid jobs now, as AI is getting better at doing the sorts of jobs that people used to do for very high pay, such as accountants, mortgage originators, management consultants, financial planners, paralegals, radiologists, general practice doctors, and surgeons. When jobs are automated, this lowers wages in two different ways. First, just the obvious reason that people are laid off. Since the people who are laid off because of automation tend to be middle-skilled jobs, then these workers very often have to go on and compete for lower-skilled jobs. So they're going to move from what was a middle-paying job to a lower-paying job. And second, the threat of automation may cause lower wages as a human worker tries to be cheaper than a robot or a computer. Now, this one is interesting because all the economists I read seem to agree that automation definitely lowers wages short term. There's no question about that. As soon as jobs are automated, workers are laid off and it lowers wages for everybody. But the point of disagreement is long term. Some economists believe that when a robot or a computer replaces a human worker, then general productivity goes up, and that in the long term, this is going to raise wages for everyone. There are other economists who disagree about this. So everyone agrees it lowers wages short term. People aren't sure whether it lowers wages long term. I also want to point out that one of the research papers I read, authored by Mischel, Schmidt, and Schierholtz, specifically said that the government likes to blame automation for lower wages, but they argue that lower wages are the result of conscious, purposeful government policy, and the government is just using automation to deflect away from themselves and their bad policy choices. Next reason for lower wages, contract work. This is when a company needs a job done, but instead of hiring a person as part of the company to do it, they hire either one, multiple independent contractors who each do part of the job, or two, they outsource it to a company that does this work. Each of these would be under the umbrella of contract work. In the past 40 years, there has been a huge increase in service contractors, especially for the lowest wage jobs. Wages and benefits, both, tend to be a lot lower for these outsourced workers than if those same workers were doing the job in-house, officially hired by the company. For example, Dubai and Kaplan looked at two major jobs that are often outsourced. They looked at janitors and security guards. Dubai and Kaplan were able to prove that, in fact, outsourced workers are most often paid less. Dubai and Kaplan were able to prove that the difference in pay between the in-house worker and the outsourced worker is definitely not because of skill. In fact, they were able to follow individual workers who had worked in-house for some company and then were moved to contract work, and their pay was lowered even though it was literally the same worker doing the same job. The difference in pay was clear. In fact, outsourcing of this kind of work is much more likely when the person is being paid well. For example, if a company paid their janitors really well in comparison to the other companies around them, those janitors were much more likely to be outsourced, they'd all be fired, and then moved to some kind of contract work where their work is officially outsourced and their pay is lowered. The higher the pay, the more likely they would be fired and then outsourced. When states have higher union density, employers in those states respond by firing a lot of the workers and then rehiring them as outsourced contract workers so that they can stop giving them benefits and start giving them lower pay. This contract work is often part-time, specifically so that whoever is hiring this contract worker doesn't have to give them any benefits that a full-time worker would get. Our economy is slowly moving away from full-time work to part-time work. So from the worker's perspective, they have to get multiple part-time gigs in order to cobble together one full-time job with no benefits. You can see this very clearly with what is called the sharing economy. Things like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash will often advertise themselves as great places to work because, after all their workers are just independent contractors working for themselves on their own terms. Businesses like to claim that this kind of contract work, this kind of sharing economy, is flexible. And it might be, but workers who have been surveyed about this kind of work say that very often they only get 1 week of advance notice about their schedule and what kind of work they're going to be doing. While businesses like to call this the sharing economy, researchers like to call this precarious work because that's what it is. It's precarious. Now, researchers are definitely not trying to claim here that all contract workers are low paid. That wouldn't be true. In fact, some contract workers actually make more than the full-time workers doing the same job, specifically because those full-time workers are getting paid not only in a paycheck, but also in benefits. That is true of some workers, but researchers have found that a lot of these contract workers are low-wage workers who are getting paid a lot less because they're doing contract rather than full-time work. The picture for low-wage contract workers, like janitors and security guards, is bleak. Imports are another reason for low wages. In the 1950s and 1960s, U.S. factories made more of the goods that U.S. people bought. Because there were lots of U.S. factories making these goods, that meant that there were lots of factory jobs that tended to be pretty good that U.S. workers could work at. But in the 1970s, goods started to be made more and more overseas in low-wage countries. For the companies that were moving overseas, this was a no-brainer. Workers in low-wage countries were paid so few wages that it dramatically decreased the cost of manufacturing a good. So much so that it was still cheaper for companies to manufacture a good very far away and then have it shipped across the ocean to the U.S. to be sold. It was still cheaper than hiring U.S. workers to make that same good here, even without the shipping costs. And in fact, lots of manufacturers did this. From the 1960s to the 1990s, manufacturing imports increased 3 times as a proportion of GDP. But for U.S. workers, this was crushing. This was a huge loss of jobs that used to be stable, good jobs that paid pretty well. Now these factory jobs have mostly disappeared, and the ones that are left have to compete with the lowest wage workers around the world. So the pay just keeps getting lower and lower and lower for these jobs. A lot of the workers that 50 or 60 years ago would have had factory jobs have now moved into service or retail. Service and retail are 2 sectors that are absolutely notorious for very low wages, for terrible working conditions, for 0 benefits. Plus, a lot of these service and retail jobs are part-time, specifically so that the company doesn't have to give a full-time worker benefits. Large corporate buyers have decreased wages. Now, this one takes a little bit of explanation. In the 1970s, suppliers started having to sell to large corporate buyers rather than smaller or mom and pop shops. Now, let me explain what this means. For me, I have to put it in concrete terms, so that's what I'm going to do for us in this video. Imagine that you are the owner of a company that makes toasters. In the 1950s, if your toasters were a household name and you sold quite a few of them, probably the way that would have worked was you would sell your toasters to 1,000 different mom and pop shops around the country who would then resell them to customers. But by the 2000s, those same toasters were being sold to huge companies, large buyers like Walmart and Target. That's what it means when economists say that production is having to be sold to large buyers now. This happened because of corporate mergers in the 1970s when antitrust laws stopped being enforced so well. In the early 1980s, most manufacturers sold only 10% of their stuff to large buyers. But by 2014, most manufacturers were selling 25% of their stuff to large buyers. These large corporate buyers demand lower and lower and lower prices to compete on the market. In fact, it's completely normal for large buyers to demand a 5% reduction in costs annually. Even if you, as a toaster factory owner, want to do right by your workers, in a lot of cases, you can't, because the large buyers who buy all your toasters are demanding lower wages and refusing to work with any factory that is unionized. A bunch of small independent buyers like mom and pop shops could never put pressure on manufacturers this way. If one of them demanded that you lower wages, you just say, okay, I'm going to go sell to the other 999 mom and pop shops that I sell to. But large buyers can put this kind of pressure on factories. If you pay your workers well, you cannot sell to a lot of these large buyers and you'll go out of business. Let me give you some real-world examples. Massey Coal Company contracts with small operators to extract from its worst mines and demands that those mines pay very low wages. Car repair shops receive 75% of their revenue from insurance companies who demand that mechanics are paid low wages. When Ferris Fashions began selling exclusively to Walmart, Walmart never stopped creating pressure on them to lower production costs, and the factory jobs at Ferris Fashions became badly paid. Now let's look at the macroeconomic policy that has led to lower wages and higher unemployment. Now, in most of the economic articles that I've read that talked about this, they focused exclusively on the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board, or Fed for short, is an organization that administers monetary policy in the United States. The Fed tinkers with the U.S. economy in order to keep unemployment at around 3%. They really don't want it to go higher or lower. The Fed sees wage inflation as a threat to price stability. They don't want wages to go up. They don't see it as a positive economic outcome. They want a percentage of Americans to be unemployed and for those of us who are employed to have lower wages. Now, this video is not going to go into the details of why the Fed wants this, because that is far beyond the scope of this video to explain economic monetary policy of the Federal Reserve Board. But I will just say, in the Fed's mind, what they're doing is keeping the economy stable. They don't want another Great Depression. They're scared of that, and they are willing to allow people to be hurt right now in order to avoid another Great Depression. That's their thinking. Now, whether this thinking is correct or not is totally beyond the scope of this video. I'm just saying that's why they do what they do. But it doesn't really have to be this way. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the Federal Reserve had a different economic policy, one that wasn't so scared of higher wages. They allowed the U.S. to be at full employment, which is very close to zero unemployment. Almost everyone who wants a job has one. They allowed the U.S. to be at zero unemployment about 70% of the time during this period of time between the 1950s and 1970s. In contrast, since the 1970s, the US has been at full employment only about 30% of the time. In fact, in the 1980s, the Fed chair explicitly increased levels of unemployment. And the Federal Reserve's policies have worked. In 2015, the unemployment rate was 6% for people with a high school diploma and 3.5% for people with a bachelor's degree. So you can see the Fed's unemployment policy hurts the poorest people the most. Although I will say it hurts middle class people as well. Researchers say it hurts basically everyone except for the richest Americans. When we're closer to zero unemployment, that's a situation in which incomes will rise for both rich and poor. But as unemployment increases, rich people's incomes rise while poor people's incomes don't. The decline in the minimum wage has also decreased wages across the United States. The real inflation-adjusted minimum wage fell 47% between 1968 and 2012. But here's the thing, the falling minimum wage depresses all other wages as well. The 1980s was the worst of this time period for the minimum wage. Congress didn't increase the minimum wage at all through the entire 1980s. And during this period of time, the real purchasing power of the minimum wage decreased by 30%. Now, less than 10% of the working population is directly affected by the minimum wage. Although lots of politicians like to pretend that the minimum wage only affects teenagers working for extra cash, that's not actually true. 70% of the people affected by the minimum wage in the 1990s were adults. Over 35% of those were sole wage earners for their families. On average, minimum wage workers earn about 45% of their family's annual earnings. But the minimum wage has an indirect effect on the overall wage structure for lots of other people as well. The minimum wage sets a standard for everybody else. In fact, when researchers look back at historical information from the 1970s and 1980s, what they find is the rising and falling of the minimum wage impacts everybody else so much that it explains about 25% of the wage picture for men and about 30% of the wage picture for women. Since the 1970s, managers, shareholders, and professionals are taking up so much of each company's profit that there's hardly any left for the non-college educated workers. CEO and executive wages are generally tied to the profits the company makes, but ordinary workers' wages aren't. So as the company makes more and more and more money, CEOs and executives get huge bonuses or huge wage increases, while the workers at the bottom, who, by the way, are actually doing most of the work, are not sharing in those profits. The richest in the US have become even richer thanks to record profits and stock markets, but the average worker has not seen that benefit. Why? Well, that brings us to the next point. There's been a rise in businesses with a shareholder orientation. This is a rise in businesses oriented toward quick profits rather than being more concerned with long-term stability or doing what's best for the workers. In the 1970s, businesses switched from a stakeholder orientation to a shareholder orientation. Let's talk about both of those orientations. When businesses had a stakeholder orientation, profits were shared between workers, customers, the community, and shareholders. Between World War II and around 1973, unions ensured that laborers received a fair share of the profits. This was the so-called Treaty of Detroit. Business owners entered into a kind of social contract with their workers in which they shared profits and security. Employers were loyal to workers and unlikely to fire them, and in return, workers were loyal to the businesses that they worked for. Workers would get lifetime jobs, guaranteed job security, and yearly raises. In return, employers got a committed workforce, they got control over their labor supply, and they entered into a truce with labor unions. Both sides benefited because the workers had customized training. So a lot of workers weren't just a worker at any firm, they knew exactly how to do their job best for that particular company. In the 1970s, we see the rise of a shareholder orientation. Maximizing stock for shareholders became the only goal of many businesses. Business owners broke the contract with workers that they had had previously and stopped honoring that contract. Companies started looking just for short-term growth and not looking for long-term goals. Why did this change happen? One reason is activist shareholders who began demanding higher profits of the businesses that they held shares in. Instead of a patient, relationship-oriented shareholder, there began to be an impatient, profit-oriented shareholder who demanded quarterly returns. There was more of a drive toward cost reduction, which requires flexibility in workers. Downsizing really took off in the 1980s and 1990s. Banking deregulation created changes in corporate finance and governance, which created this shareholder revolution. By now, the social contract that used to exist between workers and employers is gone. I think we might have saved the biggest factor causing wages to decrease for last, which is unions. Unions used to be much more powerful in the United States, but they have declined in power. In the 1970s, around 30% of all workers were in unions. By the 1990s, only about 15% of workers were in unions. And by around the 2000s, only about 7% of workers were in unions. And of course, during this same period of time, wages decreased dramatically. Unions helped normalize fairer wages for everyone, not just union members. There were several reasons for this. One is because unions became a voice that advocated for fair pay. And second, employers may raise wages because they're afraid their workers will unionize. So unions tend to raise the average wage and decrease wage inequality. Of course, the decline in unions hurts everyone, but it hurts the union workers the most. About 75% of total wage losses were experienced by 13% of workers who were previously in unions and aren't anymore. The decline of unions affects middle-wage men the most, which might explain why men's wages have declined so much more than women's wages have. Overall, declining unions explains as much as 50% of the decline in male blue-collar wages. Now let's briefly look at some of the incorrect explanations that people sometimes believe for lower wages, just very quickly. One is the entry of the baby boom generation into the labor force. Could it be that so many new workers into the labor force depressed wages? No, there's no evidence of that. The timing was off. The baby boomers entered the workforce during the 1960s and early 70s, which was before the wage collapse. Could it be that more women entering the workforce depressed wages? No. There's no evidence of that either. Economists have found no evidence despite lots of research testing this theory. Could it be that legal and undocumented immigration is decreasing wages? After all, if we have an influx of new workers coming in, then surely that would decrease wages for everybody, right? Except no, there's no evidence of that either. There is no evidence that wages are lower in cities with more immigrants. And finally, some researchers have tested the theory that maybe changes in educational attainment have caused lower wages somehow. With more people going to college and getting degrees, somehow they're flooding the market and changing the expectations. But there's no evidence of this either. Instead, the evidence runs the other way. More workers are getting degrees in response to the lower wages in the job market. You realize you have to have a degree to be able to even make a reasonable living wage. Let's summarize. Why are wages so low? Well, it's not just one cause, it's multiple causes, and all of these hit around the 1970s. Automation, contract work, imports and trade policy, large corporate buyers, macroeconomic policy, specifically the Federal Reserve Board, minimum wage decline, redistribution of wages within companies, the shareholder orientation of companies, and unions losing power. All of these are reasons for wage stagnation and decline in the United States.